conversing with ARUNA CHAKRAVARTI, who's not just a dear friend but a tremendously accomplished writer and academician, as you have just heard from the number of books in a variety of genres that she has produced. Now, this particular volume comes as a real surprise. You know, it's a collection of 13 ghost stories. And as you know, the ghost story genre is very, very old. In fact, it dates back 4,000 years. And the earliest example is on a piece of Egyptian pottery, you know, about this ghost who was plaguing a certain living person because his tomb had fallen into ruins. And of course, we have Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, who translated the Betal tales from Sanskrit literature, 11th century, in his Betal Panjo Binshati. Another very popular book in Bengal is, of course, Thakurmar Jhuli, which came out in 1907, which is a collection of folk tales about Bhoot and Pikni and other supernatural creatures in Bengali. We also, another early example is from Pliny the Younger, who writes about Athenodorus, a Stoic philosopher, who was visited by a ghost in chains, and this very humorous bit about Athenodorus finishing what he was writing, closing his book, and then looking to the ghost and, you know, conversing with him. So the ghost apparently takes him outside, and Athenodorus marks the spot. And the next morning he has the laborers dig up that spot and they find human remains, which are then given a proper burial, and after that the ghost doesn't haunt the mansion anymore. We also have, of course, the ghost of Virgil accompanying Dante in the Divine Comedy. We have Shakespeare's ghost, you know, Hamlet's father, Banquo in Macbeth, the ghost of Julius Caesar visiting Brutus. So, you know, ghosts have sort of haunted, excuse the pun, literature for many, many years. And in Bengal, we have, you know, Rabindranath has Udito Pashan and Monihara, two famous ghost stories. Sharabindu Bandyopadhyay, the creator of Bomkeshwari, she has many excellent ghost stories. So I think my first question to Aruna would be, what made you choose this genre, Aruna? Because earlier you have written historical fiction, you've translated classical literature from Bengali, so you've also translated poetry. So what made you turn to ghost stories?
You know, historical fiction obviously involves a lot of research. And also, not only research, field work. You actually have to visit the places you're writing about and examine the topography. And generally, there's a lot of activity sort of going on before you actually write a historical novel. Now, sorry. Now, what happened was, actually what happens is, after writing a historical novel, I usually feel tired, you know, I don't want to take up another historical novel, and I usually turn to a translation. Now, this time also, after writing the Mendicant Prince, I did my translation of Latin stories, and even after that, I really didn't, you know, feel up to doing another historical novel, you know, do all that research and all that hard work. And so I thought, let me be a bit lazy and let me do something simple. Like, let me just write a story, which will spring straight from the imagination. It will not need any reading or any research. So, and then I also wanted to break out of the mold. You know, the mold that I had created for myself, historical fiction and translator, etc. Fiction writer and translator. And and of course I've written short stories also. I had 2 volumes of short stories before this. But I wanted to do something totally different. And then, you know, just in an idle moment, I thought, why don't I write a ghost story? And because, you know, as a young woman, as a young mother and a young aunt, I used to gather my nieces and nephews and daughter and even the neighboring children and tell them ghost stories. And I remember the expression on their faces. the fear and the fascination and the absolute, and they used to crawl into my bed under my quilt, and they usually enjoy winter evenings particularly. So I thought, let me revive it. The story that I wrote, or the stories that I've written, are not stories that one tells children. They're adult stories. But I thought, let me just try my hand at a ghost story. And the first story I wrote was that one winter night. And that story, it began with all the paraphernalia of mystery and 5 people sitting around a fire while there's a raging storm, wind, thunder, bitterly cold night. I began with that. And somehow then the story, got written. So then I wrote this story, and I enjoyed the process. I found myself very excited. Then I wrote another, and I wrote another. And at that time, I had no idea that, publishing or who will publish, because publishers are not very interested in short stories. They prefer novels. So at that time, I didn't think of publishing. I was just enjoying writing the stories so much. And ideas kept coming one after another. And so I wrote 11 stories. So after 11 stories, then I thought, now that I worked so hard, let me, try and see if I can publish. And I sent it to 3 publishers, and I was quite surprised to find that all 3 had accepted them. And it was at that moment that I realized that ghost stories were the in thing, and publishers were looking for ghost stories. And of course, I signed up with Penguin, and then my editor, she said, Urmadi, write 2 more. So 13 stories will make it really nice and spooky. So then I wrote 2 more stories. And so this is how this book came about.
I love your detail about, I wanted to relax, so I wrote 13 stories. Quite wonderful. Now, Aruna, would there be any influence of regional Bengali folklore on your work? Because this is a very Bengali collection. The characters, almost all the stories are set in Bengal or are about Bengali people. So, any influence of Bengali folklore?
Yeah, that's true. You're quite right. These stories are actually steeped in the Bengali ethos. Not only Bengalis in Bengal, but Bengalis living outside in Bihar, in Delhi, etc. And so yes, I wouldn't say that they were influenced by any folklore as such, except for one story, Grandmother's Bundle, which actually contains 3 folk stories. 3 stories that I have heard as a child from my mother, aunts, even the neighboring Mashimas, Bishimas, etc. And so these 3 stories are the stories that I've actually heard. They are stories within a story, but it sort of goes beyond those the 3 folk or grand Thakumar Chuli type stories, because it also introduces other elements. Like there is this Thakuma who is telling these stories. She has a philosophical approach to each story, and she imparts this wisdom or this a moral lesson to her granddaughters, and they agree that it has worked for them. Like this, the narrator is actually 70 years old when she writes this story, and she talks about stories which she had heard when she was 7 or 8, and she feels that what her grandmother had told her, influenced her to become, made her the woman that she became. Because she was quite a horrible little girl when she was born, but then she grew up to be a more responsible adult. And then there's something, there is another element in this particular story, that it also expresses the Bengali tendency to create an affinity with all created things. Bengalis, I suppose all Indians, like for instance, they worship trees, stones, they worship animals. For instance, the tulsi tree is supposed to be the guardian of the household. and women, housewives, they light a lamp and they do pranam to it every evening because the Tulsi is protecting them. The banyan tree is supposed to be like a paterfamilias, a patriarch figure. In fact, when someone dies, when the head of a family dies, then the consolation that is given to the wife and children is that only Boto Vrikho Shuyachan, that is, banyan tree. He's just lying down, but he's still there protecting you, like a Boto Vrikho. So like this, and even the sun, moon, planets, we appropriate them, they become Shuji Mama, Chand Mama, because children love the best part of their lives, I think, are in their Mama Badi, because they're petted and pampered. And so all these, they form relationships with all creative, animate as well as inanimate. So, so there are other lessons also running side by side with these three stories. This is three stories within a story, so to speak, and this, I think, is the only one which is directly influenced by folk literature, and also they stand out. This story actually stands out from the others. It's quite different from the others. It has an element of humor, and which the others don't. I mean, ghost stories are not supposed to be humorous, they're supposed to be horrifying, frightening.
Now, was it a conscious decision on your part to blend the horror genre with the genre of the supernatural? Horror, we would think of, say, a writer like Stephen King, whereas, ghost stories would be, say, Edgar Allan Poe, or even some stories of Arthur Conan Doyle. So, but you, in a number of your stories, House of Flowers, Motorcycle Rider, One Winter Night, the first one, Caregivers of Ghazipur, there's also a horror element, which usually comes at the end of the story. So was this a conscious decision on your part to blend these two genres?
No, I wouldn't say it was conscious. Very frankly, these stories were not conscious. I usually begin with something, it might just be a face that I remember, and they are all kind of rooted in my childhood. Most of these stories are inspired by something or the other that happened in my childhood. It could be a face that has stuck with me for no rhyme or reason, I don't know why. It could be a conversation that I've overheard as a child, made no sense of it. But as an adult, then I saw, I understood it, and there were some sinister nuances in the story. It could be a phrase that I've read somewhere, I've even forgotten, which book or who the writer was. But something starts off the story. My stories always begin this way. I never construct them. I never believe in starting off with a beginning and a middle and an end all charted out. It just begins with something. And then it just slowly grows, develops, ideas come, some ideas are rejected, but some are accepted. And somehow I get the feeling that the story writes itself. So, no, there was no conscious decision. But there was one thing, these stories don't really belong to the gothic horror genre. Where you have all these, blood-sucking bats and vampires and heads rolling and fountains of blood. These are basically human interest stories with a supernatural twist at the end. So they're structured in a way in which they begin very innocuously. They begin with somebody walking down, from a village to the town, a boy, or a marital spat, a family spat, or a little girl who's, whose father has recently been transferred, and she hangs around a cemetery which is close by. So, little things. But then, as the story, after a while, a hint is dropped, a little hint, which startles the reader. The reader probably begins by thinking it's just like one story. It could be a domestic story, a love story, a story of romance, but then at one point there's a little hint which tells the reader that it's really going in a different direction. And then after another few pages, another stronger hint. and another strong. And gradually this supernatural or this horror or whatever, builds up. And the last line is really one, it sort of explodes, the whole thing comes together. So that's the way these stories have been written.
It's interesting that you mentioned the human element, the human interest part, because I think a lot of the charm and the attraction of these stories are the human beings, not the ghosts, and also that liminal space that you establish, that these ghosts also have a past, as in Caregivers of Gazipur, that you see them as very humane people looking after this injured boy, and then suddenly there's that transformation at the end. So I guess this part of the, fleshing out the human characters would be something that you would have in common with your earlier training in fiction writing. But what would be the new challenges that you would face in writing ghost stories as opposed to other kinds of writing?
Challenges. The most important challenge is to make the stories believable. Because as I said, it's not a horror story, which everyone knows is not so. It's not true anyway. But as Coleridge said, that in order to write a supernatural poem, you have to, you have to induce in the reader a sense of, that they have to give up their, what is the term?
Yes.
Willing suspension of
disbelief.
Willing suspension of disbelief.
Yes.
So that is the way I looked on these stories. That they should begin, in a normal kind of a manner. And gradually the reader has to be drawn into the story. Has to start being convinced about the characters, the events, what is happening. And then gradually, then it gets to the point where they even accept the supernatural part. So that's the way I thought of writing these stories. Actually, if you think of the first story, the grandmother's bundle, even that, the characters are very distinct. Like even the mother who appears hardly, doesn't appear at all. But even her character is established.
Right.
She's the kind of person who's very, she has a volatile temper, and the grandmother protects the little children from her anger and all that. So each character, I have tried to give them personalities, distinguishing features, characteristics, and make them like live human beings. So when the supernatural happens to them, it sort of blends spontaneously. That is, that's the effort that I made, that it should blend spontaneously with what has gone before. They shouldn't be like two different things. Because suddenly it was one story, it became another story. It should be like that. So that was the major challenge.
And
blending the real with the supernatural.
Right. And you talk about persuading your readers, so like in More Things in Heaven and Earth, you have a character within the story who's completely skeptical.
Yes,
and who then, undergoes this experience, and so her stance changes. So,
she gets the shock of her life.
Yes.
Because she's been arguing with her friends that this is all nonsense, and how can sensible people, educated people, people who believe in science, who studied science, believe in all this nonsense. And then she gets this terrible experience.
Yes. Now, are any of these stories based on either your personal experience or anything that you've heard, your friends or relatives having seen a ghost or an apparition?
Yes. No, I must confess that I haven't ever seen a ghost. I believe in sixth sense, yes. I believe in sixth sense. And I felt it myself also. Suddenly, out of the blue, I felt that this I must do, and I must do it immediately. Now, why I must do that, was probably puzzling at that moment. But later on hindsight, I feel that if hadn't I, sort of grasped that moment, hadn't I listened to my instinct, I would have regretted. So that has happened to me, and that I admit, I agree that there is such a thing as sixth sense. But there are a lot of people who actually see ghosts, including Rabindranath, who believed in ghosts. He used to practice planchette. He used to have planchette sessions. After Conan Doyle, and many people. Actually, when I was at the Lit Fest this time, my co-panelists were Chonjal Roy and Daisy Lockwell, and they both written ghost novels. And they both were convinced that, they say that they'd seen ghosts and that they were convinced that they were such. And so when the question, the Q&A session started, somebody got up and said, Aruna, I want to ask you a question, that now that you've written 13 ghost stories, do you believe in ghosts? So I told them, I said, look, I neither believe nor disbelieve. I can only say that I haven't seen a ghost. But if someone says I've seen a ghost or I've seen something, I can't say no, you're talking rubbish. Because obviously, but what I really believe, Shormishtha, is that some people are more mediumistic than others. Some people are able to bridge this connection between real life and the other life, and are able to see things which other people cannot see. So I don't disbelieve this thing, but as I said, I haven't ever seen. But of course, some of the stories were stories which I had heard, like...
and one of them begins, this is a true story.
Yes, that was the story that I heard. The truth is stranger than fiction. Yes. A friend of mine had told me this story, and about how a series of suicides happened in the family, all within a few months. And she had actually seen, she said that she had seen the ghost. But of course, the way I've written it is not the way she told me, and these things happen, you get an idea, but then you work around it, and your imagination takes over and you write it in there. But this was one story that I definitely heard. Then there was another story, which was told to me. This story, there are more things in heaven and earth, heaven and earth. There is this story which Maya, the first, the lady who first tells the story, and she says that she was, she didn't believe in god men and god women, but then she was persuaded by her neighbors to go and see a god woman. It was actually Ananda Mohima, who had a ashram in Calcutta. But of course I didn't use that name, I used another name. And she had told me that, I sort of went in a spirit of total disbelief. And I told myself that if this lady, this god woman, which she calls herself, is truly omniscient, she'll know my name. And so when I stand before her, she'll call me by my name. And this story was actually heard, and I think her daughter is here in the audience, daughter and son-in-law. And so this lady told me this story, and I put that story down, that she goes to this, to do pranam namaskar to the god woman, and the god woman just looks around and says, her name was Maya. Says, where's Maya? Maya. And the name of the lady was also Maya. I've actually put her name, used her name. So I have heard some of these in bits and pieces, not the entire story possibly, but yes, there are quite a few stories which I've heard. But most of them are, they are triggered off by, as I said, some memory, and then somehow the imagination takes over and the story gets written.
You show a real affinity for village life, it's beautifully portrayed. Of course, we have a lot of urban stories as well. There's a story that's set on a college campus, for example, but especially in the caregivers of Ghazipur, I think you really, the utter destitution of the people who have to travel from the village to elsewhere, leave their home, the little moody tight in a little bundle at their shoulder. So there's a lot of empathy for the hardship of village folk, and again their attachment to nature. the little girl who can't let go of the river, the tree, the flowers. Even after she dies, she is attached so much to them that she can't leave. So where did that come from?
That is an interesting, I'm glad you asked this question. You know, after I wrote The Inheritors, which was about my own paternal ancestors, I thought of writing one about my husband's family. Now, my husband's family, they came from Furidpur in Dhaka, and they came to India, I think soon after independence, either in 1947 or in 1946, and before all the killing and all that happened. But they came, and it was interesting because in their family, they have saint. I think some of you may have even heard of him, Ram Thakur. Have you heard of Ram Thakur?
Yes, yes.
So Ram Thakur was my husband's granduncle, my Babar Kaka. So I thought, and I used to hear, of course, you know, when I got married, my mother-in-law had passed on. But my aunts-in-law, the ladies, the people who had left their ancestral home and come to Calcutta and had really had a hard life, you know, they had to struggle a lot. They used to tell me stories about how the old life was, you know, a huge mansion in which hundreds of people, huge extended family. And you know, it was all very colorful, the amount of fish that was brought in every day, and the amount of, you know, and the Durga Puja celebrations, the Jagadhantri Puja celebrations, and how relatives and friends from the surrounding villages would come. And they would come in boats, because there was so much, there are so many water bodies in Bangladesh. Now it's Bangladesh. So they would come by boats, and they were called Nayori. And so they used to come and all that. So I used to hear those stories, and I wanted to write a similar book. But somehow that book never got written. And then, you know, when I started this story, I actually, my head was really filled with that part of my inheritance or family or whatever. And so and actually I went and visited the village where my husband's family was. It was a village called Dinga Manik, which is now called Surendrapur. So sometimes, like, as you know, I go to Bangladesh very often. So on one of these trips, I went to this place, and what my husband's family, his parents and his father and uncles, and what they had done was that they had you know, created a trust. And all their lands and they had a lot of property, there was zamindars. So they had transferred it all to the trust in Ram Thakur's name.
Right.
And then they had come practically penniless, you know, with whatever the jewels the women were wearing, whatever little money was in the house. And they had to struggle because they opened a shop and just in order to make, you know, ends meet. And people, they who were zamindars became shopkeepers. It was very hard. I mean, that part of my husband's family is extremely interesting, and I think it should make a good novel. Only I don't know if I have the you know, the tenacity or the hard work.
The long road to Karimganj. That's
the
where
story.
you, yeah.
So that is where this story actually derives from that experience. So when I went and on one of these trips, I said I want to visit this place, and I went there. And of course, it's a huge ashram. This trust was made in the name of Ram Thakur, and the trustees were both Hindus and Muslims, because there are a lot of Muslim disciples. Ram Thakur had a lot of Muslim disciples, and so when I went there, I was charmed. You know, now of course it's a huge place. You know, there's a movie, there's a guest house, there are, and the old mansion of course is there. And I was taken around. I was shown the birthing room, in which both Ram Thakur was born and my husband was also born. So, and then all the fields and water bodies, huge estates, were all now in the ashram. And the best part of it, you know, I found the Hindus and Muslims, they were eating together, you know, side by side. No sort of, no problem, you know, and no issues between them. And then I even spoke to one of these Muslim women, some of them, and I said that, don't you have problems with this kind of thing, that you are Muslims and you are disciples of a Hindu. So she said, no, there's no such problem, because around Dingamani, all the other villages, 6 or 7 villages, we are all disciples, we are all disciples of Thakur, and that's that. We've never had any problems. So I was really very charmed and very, very interested. So that came, into this story. Now, it had to be also a ghost story. And I remember one of my aunts saying that she lost her little daughter when she first came to Calcutta. And this little girl was so unhappy leaving leaving her own home, the huge house and the orchards and the river and the gardens and roaming around. And then living cramped in a small one-room house in Kolkata. So she was so unhappy and she used to cry so much. Finally, she died of typhoid. So even the two got blended. But something interesting happened. When the reviews started coming out, a couple of reviewers pointed out that this story is actually inspired by a story by Vibhuti Vibhuti Bhushan had written a story about a little girl haunting a mansion, and a guest comes and he recognizes her. He thinks she's a real girl, but and then suddenly he sees a photo which was taken 30 years ago, and that same little girl is there in the photograph. So and that was Vibhuti Bhushan's story. Now this part of it must have been lying dormant maybe at some point, and that came and got mixed up with the story. So things like these happen.
Right.
Things like this happen.
Right.
So when you talk of influences, that is these are the kind of influences. But by and large, these stories are stories which are whispering from the imagination. And of course, there are influences, like for instance, the House of Flowers. I've been to China, but I haven't been to 18th century China. So the ambience of the brothels and the tea houses and the little people there, I mean, obviously taken from Pearl Bucks, works and all that. So these influences, of course, are there.
Do you have any favorite among these 30? Any favorite story of yours?
When a mother with a large family,
I thought you'd say that.
so likes all the stories, but like all the children. But some favorites, so horny or like someone gets the bigger piece of fish every time. Somebody. So that happens, and so my favorites are The Necklace,
Right.
and Vendetta,
Okay.
and then and what else? And The House of Flowers, of course. And I think maybe there are more things in there than others.
Right.
So because these are more, these were more complicated. They sort of took a lot more out of me than the others. The others were more easily written, but these had to be worked upon. I mean, they were more challenging.
So
I like
promo
them.
of Vendetta is really excellent. That just from that very ordinary beginning, and then the woman just starts getting depressed, and how it moves, and nature sort of takes over. I mean, it's really wonderfully done. I think it's one of the most successful.
I tell you
stories.
something interesting that happened in the Kolkata Lit Fest. As I said, Sanjay Roy and Daisy Rockway were my panelists. So the gentleman who was the coordinator, who was the moderator, he, after all the questions and everything, he asked us to read a passage from our books. And he expressly told me that, Unnati, you read something from Vendetta. So I said, okay. And I started reading, and then I got lost in my thoughts of read, and suddenly he said, stop. And I was quite shocked. I was in fact extremely offended. I said, what's wrong with this man? And then he just said, but you're giving away your story.
Thank you so much, Aruna. Pleasure as always to listen to you, and I hope all of you get a copy of this.
Thank you so much, and I've loved this chat with you. And thank you, audience.
I think we
call you again during our book fair for a question answer session. I know you have to travel all the way back to Gurgaon, so we'll